Okay, cool. So welcome. We're here to talk about a little bit more about qualitative data. We can go ahead to the next slide, Roxanne. Before we start talking about today's topic, oh, sorry, there we go. I wanted to share a little bit about Data for Change. So some folks might be already engaged in Data for Change, but some of you might be new and sort of interested in learning a little bit more about the program. We know that data is super important for informing policies, for informing systems change, for improving our programs, and making sure our participants and clients have really great experiences when they engage with us. But it's oftentimes hard for community organizations to do that data work. And there's barriers and capacity challenges around using data to measure and strengthen initiatives and interventions. So CORE has partnered with the community health investments at Providence to help community-based organizations do more data work, and we provide technical assistance and coaching, and we've done that for over 24 organizations and grantees through the CHI over the last 2 years. And what the program looks like is we can do tailored coaching and technical assistance for a lot of different topics. We like to provide lots of different resources from data experts. There's lots of great opportunities for you to connect with other community-based organizations doing similar work or different work from yours, but learning, doing some peer exchanges, peer learning. And we also have a high focus on thinking about justice and equity and ethical data practices. And if you are interested, we do have some slots available for this upcoming year. So if you're interested, feel free to talk to Abby, Lizzie, me, Taylor, Claire at any point along the way, and we'd be happy to connect you with more information on how you can get involved. We can go to the next slide. So our goal for today, I there are a lot of you here, so you already know the value of qualitative data, right? It's such an important part of getting people sort of involved, interested in the data that you're collecting. So for your key members of your constituency, qualitative data can be really highly persuasive when we're thinking about funders, legislators, community members, and often sometimes when we think about qualitative data, we think about sort of like storytelling data, like telling those stories. And today's presentation is really meant to be a brief introduction to qualitative data collection. And the bulk of what we're talking about with qualitative is going to be talking about analysis, because that can often be a place where we sort of get stuck with our qualitative approaches. And you can spend a lot of years sort of becoming an expert in qualitative data methods, but you can also do a lot with qualitative data with more minimal training and resources. So we know you and your teams are probably already collecting qualitative data and know a fair amount about qualitative data collection. And one of our goals of today, like I said, is to help you get more out of those data. And we're also hoping that today's presentation can help you right size your qualitative data project. So just making sure that your collection and analysis processes are aligned with the goals and audience that you're trying to sort of share those data with. So it can just all happen on a spectrum, and you don't have to have fancy, expensive software to unpack your qualitative data. We can go to the next slide. So our agenda for today, we're going to do a land acknowledgement in introductions. We like to start all of our presentations with poll questions just to hear where folks are at and what they're interested in. We're going to talk a little bit more about like what is qualitative data for those of you who are new to the topic. We're going to talk about why you might use qualitative data. We'll do a little bit about how you would collect qualitative data and analyze it. And then we're going to break out into discussion groups, hopefully more time for discussion groups. And then we'll come back together just to close out. So every community owes its existence and vitality to the generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their wills. Some were drawn to leave distant home in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for generations, more generations than can be counted. This session is presented today on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. Oh, we could go to the next one. So in the chat, please introduce yourself with your name, the pronouns that you use, your organization that you're representing today, and the Indigenous lands that you are on. And if you're not sure what Indigenous lands you're on, you can use this native-lands.ca to find out more. And just an acknowledgement too that land acknowledgement alone is not enough. It's just a starting point. You can ask yourself different ways that you might be able to take action to support Indigenous communities. Some examples might be supporting Indigenous organizations by donating time or money. You can support Indigenous-led organizations by led grassroots change movements and campaigns, and you can commit to returning land. There's lots of efforts from local, state, and federal governments around the world are currently returning lands to Indigenous people, and individuals are returning their land as well. And we'll share these slides out after the presentation, so you can click through these links if you're interested in finding out more. And now I'm going to hand it over to Claire.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Claire Devine. I'm a research associate here at CORE. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm on the traditional lands of the Cowlitz, the Umatilla, and the Walla Walla. Thanks for everyone for dropping their introductions in the chat. It's fun to see where everyone's from and get to know you a little bit more. We wanted, before we kind of launch into everything, to kind of do a little bit of an overview of what we've done already as a Data for Change team and where we're going in the future. For those of you who have joined us before, you know that in the past year and a half or so, we've done a few convenings. We had a logic model webinar back in May. And then in June, we had our first annual data summit, where we actually got to see people in person and do some work and learn from everyone. If you're interested, we, and we'll do the same for this webinar as well, but we distribute the slides and the recordings after all of these. But if you don't have the recordings or the slides from the summit or the logic model webinar, feel free to reach out to us and we can send you those. Coming up, we have another webinar in October that'll focus on ethics and confidentiality. But we also wanted to introduce something new that we're doing, which is our Data for Change exchanges. So those are kind of an opportunity to build connections, share insights with other Data for Change participants. We try to pack a lot into these webinars, but that means we can sometimes have limited time for discussion. And the Data for Change exchanges sort of pick up where those discussion groups end. The default topic is going to be a follow-up from the previous webinar. So in September, we'll be chatting about this webinar. But there's also going to be an opportunity to raise additional questions or topics. So just come join us and be ready to share a bit about the work that you do, connect with your peers, engage in interactive conversations. So we just wanted to do a quick plug for that, and you'll get more information about the September one coming up. Next slide. Cool. And we also wanted to get a little bit of sense of where people are coming from, what they're interested in learning about today and moving forward. So we just had a couple of poll questions, and I think they're going to be word clouds, so you can just kind of enter in the comment or phrases for each one. The first question that we've got for everyone is, what comes to mind? What comes to mind when you think about qualitative data? So we'll give people a chance to enter those in. Okay, storytelling, texture. Definitely. The richness of qualitative data. these are really all very interesting and hopefully going to be reflected in our presentation here today. Just looking at the lived experience, seems like a couple people are flagging interviews as ways to collect qualitative data. Great. And then we had a question too about, if we can move to the next one, um, what do you want to learn more about? Uh, so either today or moving forward or using the resources that we'll share at the end. When it comes to qualitative data, what do you want to learn more about? Analysis is a big one. And interpretation, yeah. Methods. Oh, and there's stuff in the chat as well. So also the connection with quantitative data, collection methods. All of these are really important parts of the qualitative data process, and hopefully we'll be able to touch on all of them at some, to some extent today, and give you some direction for more information moving forward. So this is really exciting. Awesome. How to keep powerful stories in balance with data. All right. I think I'll hand it back over to Sarah to launch in, but thank you for sharing some of that information and some of where your kind of interests lie in this.
Great, thanks, Claire. So I'm going to spend just a tiny amount of time here kind of talking about what is qualitative data. So what are we talking about when we're talking about qualitative data? So, um, qualitative data really can represent people's hearts, stories, and wisdom. That's like the hope, the dream, the sort of the big picture idea of what qualitative data can be. But when we're talking like technically about what is qualitative data is information. All information that is not expressed by numbers or counts, right? So not quantitative data. Um, so, for example, we can think about qualitative data are all the data that provide information that are based on opinions, experience, perceptions, those types of things. And when we're using qualitative data, we're really trying to answer questions about how and why. So you can kind of keep that in mind as we're going through the slides today. We're trying to answer with qualitative data. We're trying to answer how, like how does something happen or why is it happening? Um, and one of the real advantages of qualitative data is that it can go into depth and explore ideas in a way that quantitative data cannot. So it really kind of gives us more nuance, that richness, all of those words that people were using, right? With that wisdom, that shared experience, that all kind of comes from qualitative data. And when we're using qualitative data, we're really hoping to uncover or unpack or find or identify different themes, patterns, and insights to really understand what participants are experiencing. And so we're using qualitative data to get rich descriptions, or just more insights on like again trying to understand like what we call like a phenomenon or an event or an experience. We're just really trying to get some insights on like the how and why things are happening the way that they're happening. And we can go to the next slide. Um, and as I mentioned up at the top, many of you are probably collecting some types of qualitative data already in the work that you do day to day. But there are lots of different types of qualitative data out there. So you can think about interviews, focus groups. Those are kind of like more traditional qualitative data that we might use. Lots of folks do listening sessions. So that looks a little bit different. It doesn't have to be like necessarily like a discussion. You can also think about document review or content analysis. So maybe there are some forms or some information that's already existing out there, and you're coding and analyzing documents. You can also think about visual data as being a form of qualitative data. So maybe participant photos or videos captured. You can think about observational data. So that would be sort of watching people, like watching people interact with a program or within a space. Those can be a type of qualitative data. And also, like very common type of qualitative data that gets collected are open-ended survey questions, right? So there's a question in the chat about the difference between focus groups and listening sessions. And Lizzie, I might make you answer this question because you know more about listening sessions than I do.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So focus groups are more generally more formal. You have specific questions that you as a facilitator are leading the group through and asking. Usually you'll have a guide with you. You as the facilitator are asking for information from the group. With listening sessions, it ways that I've seen that happen, they tend to be larger. Like there might be like a focus group is generally 8 to 12 people. A listening session might be a room of 40 folks. We've had data for change participants use different methodology in their listening sessions. Um, Folks might have heard of like World Cafe style, where there's a question posed to a large group. People are talking about it in a small table and giving input back to an organization or initiative. There's the methodology and types of activities that you can use to elicit um, feedback during a listening session is pretty broad, but generally they're used when folks are asking to better understand like problems, like what are the needs. Needs assessments often do listening sessions, or it may be presenting a problem to a group and asking folks for feedback on specific strategies. So it's a pretty broad group, but we'd be happy to connect you with some like specific resources and activities for a listening session if you're interested later.
Thanks, Lizzie. And just one like tiny note with all these different types of data collection, and the same thing is true for quantitative data collection, is that each type of sort of data collection that you're planning both has strengths and limitations. So you can decide, deciding which one of these is most appropriate can kind of like you can think about the strengths and the limitations and the questions you're trying to answer to help you inform like which one of these types of data collections is going to be most appropriate or are going to be best for your uses. But just to flag that quantitative data both has strengths and limitations. Qualitative data also has strengths and limitations. And each of these types also have their own like strengths and limitations within. And we could talk more about that if you're more specifically interested. But I want to keep moving to the next slide. Thanks. Oh, in the chat. Okay. So if folks are already collecting qualitative data, why don't you go ahead and chime in the chat what types of qualitative data that you collect? Oh, nobody's collecting it? Oh, here we go. Great. Okay. We can keep. Oh, cool. I love that. Okay. We can keep going and folks can chime in as we go along here. So it sounds like folks are pretty bought in on qualitative data, but we're going to also spend a little bit of time talking about why we might use qualitative data. And we could go to the next slide, Rexian. So in our current cultural moment, quantitative data really sort of kind of dominates, takes up a lot of space in the data world, right? It tends to be the like main way we think about data or like evidence, right? But we know that there's a lot of different ways of knowing, and qualitative approaches can help to amplify other types of knowledge, and specifically thinking about the lived experience of folks participating in programs. Qualitative data can be really helpful for adding context, and bringing, your quantitative evidence to life, so to speak. Qual data collection and analysis allows you to really explore more deeply people's lived experience of policies, programs, and power dynamics that might be at play. And I think when you're thinking about equity in programs, qualitative approaches can be really useful for understanding like how and why a given program or intervention may or may not work as intended. And then thinking about even more deeply within that for which groups it might be working, right? Thinking again, bringing that equity piece to it. And it can give you insights on how to improve programs or interventions from the viewpoint of a specific set of stakeholders. And then using these insights can really be helpful for steering your policies and programs in a direction that is rooted in how people actually are experiencing the program and um, um, and its influence on their day-to-day lives and worldview. So um, again, qualitative data is just an opportunity to counteract dominant culture and gets to define what counts as evidence, and really provides a chance to honor people's stories and experiences. We could go to the next slide. So with qualitative data, again, this goes back to those strengths and limitations. But with quantitative data collection and analysis, we're really seeking to find what we describe as relationships between variables. So if this happens, then this happens. Um, and we're trying to make broad statements about a population or community. And so when with quantitative data, we tend to ask questions about what, who, how much, and how often. And then with qualitative methods, we're trying to make meaning and actionable empathy by asking how and why questions. We can also use qualitative data to add nuance to our quantitative questions. So with qualitative data, just the way that data are collected, right? We're talking about listening sessions, focus groups. We're not going to be able to reach as many people, but we can ask them a lot more in-depth questions than we could in like a survey or what we would collect in program data. So it gives you a lot of information about a fewer number of people. And then with quantitative data, you get a little bit of information. You get that survey data, you get that program data. Um, you get a little bit of information about a lot more people. And we could go to the next slide. And I feel like this has kind of been reiterated throughout, but really the main reason we would use qualitative data is if you're trying to answer a qualitative question. So if you have a how or why question, if you're trying to understand like why or how something is happening the way that it's happening, then qualitative data is going to be the best approach for you to use. It gives you the opportunity to explore multiple realities from a variety of participants. One of the strengths of qualitative data, and I know someone expressed interest in this, is that you can using different methods. So using both quantitative and qualitative methods can help you what we call triangulate information. So when you're triangulating information, you're using data from a variety of sources to help you strengthen the conclusions that you're making. And it can also help, like I was talking about, there's like strengths and limitations with each type of data collection that you might use. If you're using multiple data methods, then that can help strengthen and balance out those biases that might happen with each of the different approaches. Um, and all of that kind of comes together to help improve the validity, so the like truthfulness of your findings, as well as the reliability, right? So were the data reliably collected? And you can think about a lot of different stages within your sort of like program processes where qualitative data might be most appropriate. So you can think about exploratory research, maybe like a community needs assessment type of thing, like what kinds of programs are needed out there. You can think about the design and implementation of programs. So how is this program going to work best for the people we're trying to serve? You can help develop a grounded understanding of an issue. So Lizzie was talking about using listening sessions for understanding data for change. I know lots of listening sessions happened during COVID. So just sort of really understanding like what's going on the ground. And again, adding context to your quantitative findings. And I think another interesting thing to think about with qualitative approaches is that everyone on your data team or everyone on your team has, different set of data skills, and people who are not, quote, quantitative data people, they might be really great interviewers or facilitators or really good at sort of analyzing qualitative data. Um, And so you can think about what other sort of data strengths people on your team might have, and all of that being a part of data literacy. Oh, we could go to the next slide. We already talked a little bit, so it's a few more uses of qualitative data. We already talked a little bit about storytelling, but again, these lived experiences can be really powerful for sort of encouraging, engaging funders, legislators, communities. We've talked a lot in previous sessions about client feedback loops, but one of the goals of client feedback loops, in addition to improving processes at your organization, is also to really engage and build that relationship with the people that you're serving. So qualitative, like unlike proctoring a survey or giving a survey, interviews, focus groups, these like more in like face-to-face conversations can be really helpful for starting to plant the seed and building that relationship and strengthening that relationship with your participants. And you can also use qualitative data to explore and iterate on your program's logic model, especially if you're seeing sort of like you're not seeing the outcomes that you expect or you're seeing different outcomes. Qualitative data can get, again, kind of get you to the how and the why something is happening the way that it's happening. And we have another question. Oh, sorry. So if you are interested in either of those topics, we have additional resources. We have a client feedback loop webinar, our set of slides, and then we also have a logic model webinar recording that we could share with folks. So please, again, let us know, and we're happy to share more information about either of those topics. And we could go to the next slide. So this is just sort of like if there are things in people's minds about types of questions that their organization has currently that they think would be best answered with qualitative data. So you can think how and why questions. Um, and an example from Data for Change would be like, why do Data for Change participants enroll in the program? Here's a typo. And I think as people are thinking about questions, we'll have Claire keep going because we're a little bit behind.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, so we've talked a little bit about the, different types of qualitative data collection, focusing on the why would you use it, when's the best time. But we also wanted for the rest of this, before we get into our discussion groups, to go a little bit more into the detail of what that process looks like. So if you go to the next slide, you can see this kind of overview of the process, starting with identifying the questions that you want to answer. So focusing on what are you trying to learn, why are you asking folks for this information, and then based on that, choosing a data collection method. Are one-on-one interviews the best? Are focus groups the best? Just based on the information that you have and what you're trying to get out of your qualitative data collection. So we're going to go through each of the parts of the process and just give a little bit more information and some tips and tricks at various points. So going through the design, the recruitment, the analysis, interpretation, and reporting. But yeah, starting with the design, like I said, once you kind of identify your questions, once you know the purpose and the collection method, there are a few things that you can do. If you're doing focus groups and interviews, developing a particular guide. Also in the design, this is a great time to bring a participatory lens to the process to help with the design and also to help at all parts of the process, especially when it comes to analysis. One thing that we recommend is that you document kind of everything in the design stage, writing down your data collection procedures around recruitment, outreach, any of your guides, making sure they're written down, your consent processes. Having all of these in place, being really specific and precise around them, can help counter biases. And we'll address that in a little bit, but obviously all data collection, all data analysis has some kind of bias, and so finding ways to mitigate that or reduce that is something that can really help your analysis. And then just being kind of flexible and willing to adjust after the data first comes in. You can follow up on some ideas that are emerging, especially if you didn't expect them. Look for respondents who add new detail, that kind of thing. So if you go on the next slide. And we just really like this graphic from the communities of opportunity, just focusing on at the design process and throughout the qualitative analysis process, focusing on being equitable, community-based, and participatory, and then accurate and reliable. All of that is what's going to generate the useful, actionable information. So paying attention to human subjects protection and protecting your participants, working from specific questions or things that you want to learn, all of that can sort of support that goal of useful and actionable information. So moving on to the next slide. So recruitment is a big part of all of this process. Sometimes the people that are easiest to reach aren't the entire story. So focusing on kind of getting really information-rich cases and trying to get a variation of experiences is one way to both make sure that you keep a focus on equity and to get kind of the range of information. An important part in the recruitment process is to really focus on informing participants of the purpose of what you're doing and the process, encourage them to ask questions, make sure that you're considering human protections, their comfort and their safety. Some of the information that we ask for can be very personal, even occasionally traumatic. So just keeping human protections in mind, keeping their comfort and safety in mind is a really important part of recruitment. Next slide. So once you've kind of identified your questions, identified who you're going to ask, gone through the collection, using one of the forms that Sarah talked about earlier, you have all of that, and now you're ready for analysis and kind of what do you do with all of that information. So we have a couple of comments about how to do some analysis. The first thing, just reading through all of the information that you're familiar with it prior to kind of going through and looking for any themes or trying to get information out of it. One thing we wanted to flag here is that it can help to have transcription, especially if you're doing kind of interviews or focus groups. But the problem is kind of doing transcription yourself can be really time consuming. There are professional transcription services. They can be very expensive. So kind of trying to find a balance there, trying to, in your design stage, figure out how you're going to do that. Maybe just working off of your notes that you've collected throughout the process is the best way. Once you have all that information, though, once you have your kind of notes or transcriptions, organizing the comments that you got into similar categories, and then going through and labeling the quotes with ideas and keywords and themes. And we refer to this as kind of coding the data. So going through and doing that labeling. And this is an important part to kind of incorporate as many team members as possible to kind of get reactions, especially when it comes to, are these the right themes? Are have we kind of done this part of the process correctly? So next slide. So you've gone through, you've done the labeling, you've done the coding. You can review quotes labeled with the same theme and start to summarize the main points and look for some patterns in relationships. We have a couple of examples here, but maybe those who wanted to attend your program activities regularly but couldn't were all raising issues around scheduling and the time that the activities were held. Or maybe when you look at the comments from people who decided to continue with the program, one of the main things that was coming up was the importance of the relationships they were building in the program, and that can give you information moving forward. Also putting that information into perspective, comparing your results to what you expected, comparing the results to what you expected, your original program goals, kind of coming up with any strengths and weaknesses. And then we've mentioned it throughout, but you can use those final themes and final kind of parts of your analysis to make sense of what you're seeing in your quantitative data. If you've noticed an uptick in participation, the qualitative data can help you explain, well, why might that be? Next slide. And then some just additional tips when it comes to analysis. Obviously, this is a time-consuming process, so just leaving time for it and not rushing. Keeping the purpose of your research in mind, going back to that cycle where it talked about identifying your questions at the beginning. Working with others, this includes both your team and community members. Keeping in mind that this is an iterative process, and it's supposed to be, and it's okay if you're kind of going back through and adding new themes or codes and kind of looking through the information again. And then, like I mentioned, especially around documentation and just keeping track of everything that you did, transparency is going to be key. There were comments at the beginning when we asked what folks wanted to learn about kind of like software for analysis and things like that. And we wanted to reiterate that it's important to kind of right size your methods and approach. There are definitely software choices out there like Atlas and In Vivo, and those can help you do coding of interviews or focus groups or that kind of thing. Those also may be a little bit more than your project needs. So there are alternatives, organizing your information in a spreadsheet, pulling out representative quotes into a Word document. There's a range of what might be the best for you for that project. So next slide. I flagged it before, but we wanted to include some comments around avoiding bias. Like I said, all types of data analysis, this is true for quantitative and qualitative, has some kind of bias. Confirmation bias can be a concern. The analysis is going to be a little subjective and relies on evaluator and research judgment. And that can, lead to kind of pulling out what you expect to see. And there are some ways to adjust for this, looking explicitly for contradictory evidence in the data will help minimize bias, help you see any kind of missing important points. Next slide. And some additional analysis approaches. And these are another thing that can help avoid bias or help mitigate bias is to focus on ground truthing your results. We call it member checking as well, but this is where you kind of take what you've come up with, take your themes and codes and interpretation back to the participants in the study and then get kind of a gut check. They can confirm the credibility of the information, see if the themes or categories make sense, whether the overall account is realistic and accurate. And that helps both add credibility to your conclusions by giving participants a chance to react, but it also importantly really kind of honors participant voices and expertise by inviting them back to the table and including them as part of this analysis process. Next slide. And then kind of wrapping up when you get to the reporting stage of everything. This is where you're going to want to be telling kind of a coherent story about your data, choosing some quotes to back up the points that you're making, make an argument for your claims and the stories you present. Another thing to flag, and this is kind of throughout, especially when it comes to the analysis process, it sometimes helps to have some kind of code or flag to track good quotes. So when you get to the reporting stage and you really want to share something that resonated with you, you don't have to go through everything and kind of find it again. Another important part is having a strategy to communicate back with participants around what you learned. One thing we wanted to mention too is when it comes to the reporting stage, following any ethical processes or confidentiality guidelines that you shared with participants way back in recruitment is an important point. Removing identifiable features of quotes. So this is names or locations or specific events that might make it clear who, said the thing that you're quoting. When it comes to very small populations, you might want to remove any unique kind of terms or phrases that could identify the speaker, but it's just an important part of the reporting process. And if you go to the next slide, I think we're, yeah, at the point we're going to break out into groups for about 15 or so minutes, and you'll be kind of automatically redirected into those groups, and we can go through these questions and get people's input and experiences and expertise, and then we'll all be brought automatically back really quickly at the end just to do a very brief wrap up. I think this will magically occur. Yes, in 10 seconds.